Brian, good to be with you. Good to be in Washington. You came to New Zealand last time, so we thought we'd make the effort to come to you this time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let's talk about your book, When Harry Became Sally. Well, firstly, the title. Where did it come from?
Sure, well, it comes from the movie. It may not be as popular in New Zealand as it is here in the States, but it was 30 years ago. There was a popular movie in the States called When Harry Met Sally.
That was popular in New Zealand.
It was popular in New Zealand, and so viewers will know that the central theme of that was whether or not men and women can be just friends. And so it shows you how far we've gone in one generation. We used to take sex differences so seriously that it could be a central theme of a movie, whether or not the two sexes could be just friends, or whether romance and sexual attraction would get in the way. Today, we're now debating whether or not a man can become a woman, or a woman can become a man. Back then, the debate was whether or not men and women could be just friends.
So where did this ideology come from? I mean, crudely speaking, it's that your sex is based on what's between your legs and your gender is based on what's between your ears. And I think New Zealand might be partly responsible for this gender ideology.
Sure, I mean, so part of this comes out of second wave feminism that wanted to make that distinction between sex and gender and to claim that sex was merely biological and that gender was entirely a social construct, right? And so trying to detach any connection between sex and gender. What's remarkable now about transgender ideology is that they're saying your gender identity determines your sex. So they're actually saying that it's not just that sex is a biological thing and gender is a social construct, but that your gender identity is the determination of your bodily sex. And so if the sex assigned at birth differs from your gender identity, your body should be changed to conform your body to your gender identity.
So I referred to New Zealand. John Money, who I think is a New Zealander, was one of the first to introduce this concept.
Yeah, so I mean, Money was a professor at Johns Hopkins, and back in the 60s, he was one of the first to use the term gender as applied to human beings. Historically, gender was a grammatical, linguistic concept. Sex was the term for human beings. And so Money was developing the idea in a medical context that gender was a social construct, sex was merely biological, and therefore he was reassigning, quote, reassigning the sex of his patients, saying that you could raise people either as boys or girls, that the human being is a blank slate when it comes out of the womb. And so there were several cases of botched circumcisions in which it's easier to raise that child as a girl if you've botched the circumcision. And that's what Money was advising parents to do.
So this ideology goes back as far as
the 60s. But what's noteworthy here is that in the 1970s, Johns Hopkins Hospital shut down the sex reassignment clinic. They looked at what the outcomes were for the patients who had their bodies transformed in this way, and the outcomes weren't very good. While the patients were happy as a cosmetic matter with what had taken place, their underlying psychosocial symptoms hadn't shown much sign of improvement.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that. In the intro of the book, you talk about the media's sunny depiction of gender fluidity and gender identity. But on the other hand, there's the sad reality of living with gender dysphoria. Why is the media so enamored with this? Why aren't they taking a more critical view?
Well, unfortunately, it's because of politics and because of some of the social movements in the United States, and actually, for this matter, across the globe. The T, transgender, was attached to the LGB. And so the acronym as a whole was LGBT. For most of our history, we focused on the gay marriage debate. And most Americans, I imagine most New Zealanders, would be familiar with debates over what the definition of marriage should be, how we should understand what marriage is. Because the activists were successful at redefining marriage, anyone who was on board with that seems overnight to have pivoted from the LGB to the T part. In terms of the activist community, without any general conversation amongst ordinary Americans. And now many Americans are saying, wait a minute, I might have been in favor of redefining marriage, I might have been in favor in what they would call marriage equality, but it's one thing to say two men who love each other should be able to marry each other. It's another thing to say a 5-year-old boy should be encouraged to live as if a 5-year-old girl, that a 10-year-old boy should be given puberty-blocking drugs, that a 15-year-old boy should be given estrogen. This is a radically different set of claims that are being made. And it's largely because of political reasons that they've just uncritically been embraced by the media and by politicians and more or less by the elites within our culture.
You cite studies that show that anywhere between 80% and 95% of children will revert back to their biological sex by the time they go through puberty. And puberty sort of confirms their biology. But that does mean that there's a 5% to 20% group that doesn't. So shouldn't we offer them hormone therapy and surgery, or what should we be offering them?
Yeah, I mean, what we should be offering them is forms of counseling that will help them feel comfortable in their own bodies. If they don't naturally reconcile their identity with their bodies, if they're part of that 5 to 20% that persist in their struggles, what we should be offering them is the same type of help that we would offer to someone who has a different type of body image struggle. So the answer to someone who struggles with anorexia isn't to offer them liposuction. It's to help them feel comfortable in their own body, to understand that they're not overweight, that the desire they have to starve themselves is not reflecting the reality of their body and their bodily health. In the same way, for someone who persists with gender dysphoria, the answer isn't to transform the body, it's to help them feel comfortable with the truth about their body and the truth about their identity.
So when people speak up against some of this ideology, this idea that you can just choose your sex, you get labelled a bigot, you're a transphobe, you're a hater, and yet that's not the truth. You actually care for these people. So how do you break through that noise?
Well, I mean, so partly is that you try to speak to ordinary listeners, not to the activists. The activists do this because they think it's a successful strategy is to demonize you and stigmatize you and to claim that you're a hater and a phobe and all the rest. Ordinary Americans know that this is a much more difficult question. And so what you try to convey to the ordinary listeners in your audience is that, look, this is a hard question. We disagree, but that disagreement isn't discriminatory. And we need to think critically about this because at the end of the day, what we all want are for people to flourish. But we have a disagreement about what's going to help people to flourish. And so the only way to have that conversation is to be civil, respectful, and to look at all the evidence. And it's unfortunate that some people in this debate on both sides resort to name calling and try to demonize people on the opposite side. What we have to do is just model the type of conversation we want, which is civil, respectful, and fact-based.
Right, but even medical professionals and academics, some of them are losing their jobs for speaking up, aren't they?
Unfortunately. We saw a clinician in Toronto, in Canada, who had been running a gender identity clinic for 30 years, helping children in particular identify with their body when they had gender dysphoria.
Dr. Zucker.
This is Ken Zucker. Sometimes he would recommend transition therapies for adults. He thought that it was appropriate therapy in certain circumstances, but he thought the best outcome for children would be for that child to re-identify with his or her body, not to transition. An activist targeted him, shut down his clinic. I mentioned in the book there are a number of both medical doctors and professors who spoke with me only on condition of anonymity because they're legitimately fearful that if their name got out, their position at their hospital or at their university would be at stake. So we have a very toxic environment right now in which to be having this conversation.
So some people would say, look, surely adults are free to be adults. If Bruce Jenner wants to become Caitlyn Jenner, how does that affect Ryan Anderson and Bob McCoskrie and people watching this broadcast?
Well, Bruce is free to be Caitlyn. In the United States, and I imagine in New Zealand, if an adult wants to transition and live as if the opposite sex, they're free to do that. And it may not directly affect you or me, but at the end of the day, we shouldn't simply be concerned about ourselves. Part of being good citizens, part of being good neighbors is caring about our fellow citizens and our fellow neighbors. And this means that we want people to make an informed decision. So at the end of the day, Bruce needs to decide whether he will continue being Bruce or if Bruce wants to be Caitlyn. But if we care about Bruce's authentic flourishing, we should be concerned that he makes good decisions. I mean, this is what all of us would want for ourselves and for our neighbors and for our friends.
There are legitimate disorders of sexual development, though,
Yes.
aren't there? There's intersex, but that's not part of this debate, really, is it?
Not really. I mean, because what you're looking at with what's known as disorders of sexual development, historically it's been referred to as intersex or hermaphrodites, the kind of technical medical term is a disorder of sexual development. These are either chromosomal or hormonal developmental disorders that affect the development of the body. And that's different than what we're seeing with transgender identities and gender dysphoria. These are people who, for the most part, their bodies have developed normally. So they have a fully intact male or female body. It's their identity that's not in alignment with their body. A disorder of sexual development deals with the developmental process of our sexual reproductive systems, that something has gone wrong in that developmental process. In the same way that you can have a developmental disorder with your respiratory system or with your circulatory system, you can also have a developmental problem in the development of your reproductive system. But these are biological issues, and doctors can identify and treat them, either hormonal or a chromosomal disorder. Gender dysphoria is entirely different.
In the book, you say that people who identify as transgender are more likely to suffer from conditions that too often lead to suicide. For example, depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse. Now, the transgender activists would say that it's because of the bigotry and the hate that they have to face. Is that correct?
Well, so there's no robust evidence that would suggest that. I mean, what everyone agrees is that people who identify as transgender faced a host of struggles when it comes to anxiety, depression, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, suicide ideation, suicide attempts, and unfortunately completed suicides. Where we disagree is what's the underlying cause. And some of the transgender activists, they want to say the underlying cause here is a bigoted society who won't accept people for who they are. Now, undoubtedly, there's some truth to that. Insofar as there are people who have anti-trans bigotry and who act on that, right? Who make fun of people who identify as transgender, who stigmatize and belittle people who identify as transgender, that takes its toll. But that can't account for the entirety of the poor outcomes that we see. We don't see any other minority group who is targeted for bigotry and stigma and belittled. We don't see any other minority group face such drastically poor outcomes as we do with people who identify as transgender. So something else has to be going on. And it's also worth noting that it's even before people transition that we see many of these same struggles. So that for someone who has gender dysphoria prior to their transition, they frequently have other comorbidities, other forms of psychological struggles or psychosocial struggles. And then after transitioning, many of those struggles persist, which suggests that the underlying cause of those struggles isn't a culture that's hostile to people who identify as trans, but it's going to be something with the actual underlying condition itself, or some common cause that's giving rise both to the condition of gender dysphoria and to the depression or the anxiety or the substance abuse.
So why don't medical professionals identify and deal with those
Many do.
Comorbid disorders.
So many medical professionals do. I mean, the problem that we're seeing now is that the activists and the ones who have kind of captured the attention of Hollywood and of the news media and of lawmakers tend to be the ones who favor transitioning treatments. But many physicians, whether they're endocrinologists or psychiatrists or pediatricians, they want to focus on identifying those underlying causes and treating them. And so the 6th chapter of the book just goes through case study after case study of how clinicians have treated gender dysphoria in children, not by encouraging the child to transition, but by identifying what's causing the gender identity problem, and then how can we resolve it. And so it's important to know that lots of physicians are doing precisely what you're saying. They just don't get the attention of the mainstream media or of Hollywood or of the politicians.
So the general public are told that if you speak up on this issue and if you suggest that hormone therapy and surgery is not the solution, that ultimately you're going to cause the suicide of this person. And nobody wants to cause that. So how do you respond?
Well, I mean, there's no robust evidence that suggests that you will be the cause of a child's suicide by not encouraging them to transition. And in fact, there's lots of evidence that suggests that not encouraging the child to transition is frequently in the child's best interest. And what I mean by that is that we know that 80 to 95% of children will naturally grow out of their gender dysphoria. So at the very least, for those children, it's not in their best interest to encourage them to transition. And that's something everyone should be able to agree to. If this is going to be one of those 80 to 95% of children who will grow out of it, then you shouldn't do anything to lock it in prematurely. And so I think we need to see that in many cases, even if you think that sometimes reassignment is an appropriate treatment, you should also be able to see that many times it's not an appropriate treatment. And so you can't simply therefore label anyone who would say, for this particular child, we're not going to counsel hormone therapy and surgery. We're going to try to pursue a course of therapy that'll help this child feel comfortable in his own body. You can't simply say that's going to lead to suicide. That would be irresponsible.
So in New Zealand, we have primary school children. We even have some preschool children who are being encouraged to identify as the opposite of sex. So what effect does this have on them, and what effect does it have on the other kids?
So no one really knows. To be entirely honest, no one knows what the long-term outcomes, what those long-term effects will be, because we haven't conducted any long-term studies on those long-term outcomes. We're engaged in a giant social experiment. No one knows what the long-term outcomes will be of encouraging 5-year-old boys to identify as girls and 5-year-old girls to identify as boys. We have no idea what either the physical or the psychological outcomes will be of giving a 10-year-old boy puberty-blocking drugs, giving the 10-year-old girl puberty-blocking drugs. That's because there's not a single long-term study on what the long-term outcomes are for puberty blocking.
Well, it's interesting you raise that, because that was actually going to be my next question, which is that New Zealand puberty blocking therapy is available in New Zealand, and I know around the world. Is it safe?
There are no studies that suggest it is safe for treating gender dysphoria. In the United States, it's FDA approved for treating a condition known as precocious puberty, the early onset of puberty. So the drug was developed and approved for delaying puberty to an age-appropriate time.
But still to happen biologically.
Still to happen when it's supposed to happen, right. So you go through puberty. The drug's now being used off-label to indefinitely delay puberty, so that boy will never go through male puberty. And then around age 15 or 16, they'll give that boy estrogen to try to mimic female puberty. But we have no idea what the long-term consequences are of using this drug, because we've never done it before.
But is there a psychological aspect to this with the kids?
There's a potential risk here that several pediatricians and psychiatrists have pointed to, that you might actually be locking in the transgender identity by blocking puberty. That this could be a self-reinforcing treatment protocol, that the 5-year-old boy, if you encourage him to dress as a girl for 5 years, and then that 10-year-old boy, if you put him on puberty-blocking drugs for 5 years while he continues to dress as a girl, that 15-year-old boy is going to be much more likely to continue to identify as a girl than if he had been allowed to go through puberty. If he had not been encouraged to dress as a girl, it may very well be that going through puberty as a boy with the rush of testosterone will be the developmental mechanism that helps consolidate his identity as a boy. And so by encouraging the social transition and then by blocking puberty, you may actually be locking in or encouraging that transgender identity.
So this is all challenging for families, isn't it? I mean, it can be very distressing, but I've also seen commentary about that family dynamics can play a part. In fact, it may be the parents pushing the agenda rather than the child themselves. How much does family noise play?
Yeah, so this is a great question, because sometimes we've seen in media reports, you'll see like a 5-year-old boy identifying as a girl, and then a couple paragraphs down in the newspaper it points out that the mother or the father is a PhD candidate in gender studies at the local university. And so you think to yourself, all right, that might be part of what's going on. The parents are suggesting this to the child. But other times, there can be family dynamics at play that have nothing to do with the parents suggesting this. Let me give you one example from the book. In the clinical literature, there's a case where a child's identifying as a girl, and so the parents take him to see a therapist, and the therapist just talks to the boy. Why is it that you think you're a girl? And the boy says, well, mommies are a lot nicer to girls than they are to boys. So the clinician immediately thinks, all right, something's going on in the family environment that this boy thinks that his mother is nicer to girls. So in a conversation with the mother, the clinician discovers that the mother had been raped several years earlier. She never received the healing that she needed to get over that rape, to process the rape, to have the healing and the wholeness that she needed. She had 2 children, both a son and a daughter. She was inadvertently being more affectionate with her daughter than with her son, and her son was picking up on this. And so her son was identifying as a girl as a way of trying to get more affection from his mother. So the therapist worked one-on-one with the mother, helped her heal from that rape, helped her be more affectionate with both her daughter and her son, and then her son was able to identify more readily as a boy. So he was spared a lifetime of dressing as a girl and of having puberty-blocking drugs and of taking estrogen because they were able to identify what the underlying cause was. And it was a problem not with him, it was a problem with his mother because his mother had never received the healing that she needed after the sexual assault.
You dedicate a large part of the book to people who have detransitioned. You know, they've gone the whole way. They've had the surgery, the hormone therapy. In fact, we've got Walt Heyer as a privileged guest with us here at the forum this year.
Great.
What's the message that they're giving? And but can I also add a question? Are they just the minority? Are they just the small group that are unhappy, but all the rest are quite happy?
So we don't know what the exact percentages are, but it looks like people who have transitioned and detransitioned are a minority of the general transgender population. But we don't have very rigorous statistics on how small of a minority or how large of a minority. But it tends to be I think most people would agree it's the minority of people who have transitioned will then regret it and go so far as to detransition. But what they say is that they were, many cases, they were too young to be making these decisions. That when they were teenagers, they didn't know enough about themselves or about the world or about what it means to be a man or a woman to be making radical decisions about their bodies and their identities. Many of them report feeling that the medical professionals really presented transitioning as their only option, that the medical professionals didn't discuss other underlying causes to their gender dysphoria or other potential treatments. Many of them also report that it's people like you and me who are to blame, that it's social conservatives, evangelical Christians, or conservative Catholics who are too rigid in sex stereotypes and of gender expectation and norms. And when they didn't fit those stereotypes and norms, that's partly what led them to think that they were the opposite sex. Or that it's conservatives who stigmatize and belittle and mock and humiliate transgender people, and that's what made their transition that much worse. So that should caution us that as we advocate for the truth here, we need to be sensitive that we're not exacerbating the problem. But we also shouldn't therefore give in to the ideology. And the reason that I devoted a chapter of the book to people who had transitioned and detransitioned is that their stories are never told by the mainstream media. So anyone who watches the mainstream media knows about Bruce becoming Caitlin, but they don't know the story of Walt Heyer.
No.
People need to hear both stories so that they can have a more informed perspective on these issues.
So just briefly, where do feminists stand on this issue? I mean, the fact that a biological male can choose to identify as a female, choose to be a woman.
So feminists are split on this. Some feminists who are just kind of part of the left-wing political alliance because of intersectionality and the idea that all of the various causes need to line up, they'll be in favor of some of these transgender proposals. Other feminists are a little bit more skeptical because they say that part of transgender ideology is simply doubling down on all of the sex stereotypes that they have been combating. That there's more to being a woman than high heels and lipstick and cleavage. And that many of the underlying assumptions of transgender ideology is that if you play with dolls, that means you're actually a girl trapped in a boy's body. Or that if you want to be wearing dresses, if you want to be wearing lipstick, wearing high heels, that's what it means to be a woman. And it's actually all based on stereotypes. Many of them are also concerned with men who identify as women entering into women's only spaces because they understand what the threat here. It's not from people who identify as transgender, but it's men who will disguise themselves to abuse these policies.
Will the transgender movement continue to gain traction and dominance, or do you think there's going to be a tipping point where biology and science wins the day?
Eventually there'll be a tipping point. I mean, the real question to my mind is how long? Because you can't live out a lie successfully in the long run. And so a culture built upon a lie about human nature, that sex is merely assigned at birth, that modern medicine can reassign sex, it won't be sustainable over the long run. That's why the subtitle of the book is about a transgender moment, because I think ultimately this is a moment that will pass. The question is how long, and that's going to be up to you and me and all of our viewers. Are we going to do our part to make it a short moment? Because in the meantime, there are human costs to getting human nature wrong. And so while getting human nature wrong can't stand the test of time, there will be casualties. There will be human costs in the meantime, and we have to do what we can to prevent that.
Ryan, what's your message for church leaders who are struggling with this issue? They want to speak in truth, but they also want to be pastoral and caring. They may have a member in their youth group, you know, who wants to identify as the opposite sex. They may have a member of their church, a family that's struggling with this. What's your message to them?
Sure. I mean, it's the universal Christian vocation is to be witnesses to the truth, and it's to be people who promote the truth. This is what Christ's vocation was. He came to bear witness to the truth. It's what all of our vocations entail as well. What we also need to do is connect that truth with love and express the truth in a loving, compassionate, charitable way. And so that's the main message for religious leaders. And what this will entail is connecting both faith and reason together. We have nothing to fear when it comes to the best biology, the best psychiatry, the best of philosophy. Reason and faith will go together because they come from the same source. They come from the source of truth himself. And so I think what we need to do here is to equip ourselves to be able to talk about both the theology and the philosophy, the science and the medicine that underlie appropriate responses to gender dysphoria. And then the last thought here is that John Paul II had said that the crisis of the 20th century was a crisis of faulty anthropology. He had diagnosed this when it was the Holocaust and the 2 world wars and the totalitarian regimes, when it was the scourge of abortion. I think he would have extended it to the redefinition of marriage and now the redefinition of sex and gender. All of those things get the nature of the human person wrong. And so what we have to do is bring all of our gifts and talents to bear in defending the truth about the human person.
So the natural response of church leaders is they want to speak truth, but they also don't want to be labelled transphobic. They don't want to lose church members because they're called hateful. So how do they break through that? You know,
well, I mean, I think that's where they need to be able to marshal all of the facts, all of the arguments. They won't be. You won't be able to successfully be accused of being hateful and bigoted and transphobic if you're able to speak on these issues in an intelligent and compassionate way. If you can point to all of the natural science, the medicine, the philosophy, and the theology on these issues, you can make a persuasive argument that'll be reasonable. It'll be understandable to people who are hearing you. The alternative is that if you don't say anything, it'll be someone who is less nuanced and less charitable and more of a bomb thrower who will be speaking. And then that will become the public image of what the Christian response is to these issues. So the challenge is, will you be speaking on behalf of your faith tradition and of your church, or will someone else?
Ryan, schools are being tackled with this issue, and the culture is coming at schools like a sledgehammer, and difficult for school staff, principals to stand up, and Board of Trustees as well. How should they approach this issue?
I mean, schools need to be sensitive here to see that they're competing interests. So I can understand why a high school boy who identifies as a girl doesn't want to be forced into the boys' locker room. But I can also understand why the girls don't want that boy to be allowed into the girls' locker room. And so what schools need to be able to do is to create a reasonable accommodation where that student might have access to a single occupancy facility, might have access to a teacher's facility or the nurse's office. Find a way in which the student who identifies as transgender can be accommodated, but without putting everyone else's interests at risk, right? How can we find a way to be sensitive to the interests of the student who is identifying as transgender while also being sensitive to the interests of all of the other students?
Okay, but we've tried that in New Zealand and that's not good enough.
Well, I mean, so if the other side's being unreasonable, the response is to call them out on their unreasonable demands. let's try to find a compromise on these issues. Our side's willing to compromise, the other side is unwilling to compromise. And that's no reason for our side to say, well, therefore we should just give up. It's a reason for our side to call out the other side for being unreasonable.
Ryan, what's been the response to your book? Has the media ignored it?
So no, what's been fascinating here is that the media has, a mainstream left-wing media has criticized it without even reading it. In 2 instances, both the Washington Post and the New York Times ran stories about the book where it was obvious that the author had not read the book. And then from the conservative media, it's been largely a sympathetic response. National Review, Weekly Standard, various Christian magazines, online publications as well, radio shows, TV shows. I've been on Tucker Carlson on Fox News. They've largely been interested and thankful that there's finally a book that's responding to some of the debates that are going on. Because unfortunately, it's largely been a one-side debate where people on the left have been advancing their point of view, and then there was lots of doubt, but silence from people on the right. And so now someone's given voice to, what are the arguments on the other side? What does the evidence show? And so now we can have a more intelligent conversation about these issues.
Thanks, Ryan. Next time we'll get you to New Zealand.
I'd love to, yeah.